morning. I am Giulia Cimarelli from the Domestication Lab of the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, Austria. And today I'm going to present you some exciting results we had in the past years comparing dogs living in different environments. If I ask you the question, what is a dog? Or I asked you to think about a dog, I guess that most of us will start to think about our pet dog or a pet dog of a friend who lives in our home and that comes with us in different places and maybe even sleeps in our bed. But is this really the best representation of what a dog is? If you actually look at the estimations that have been done recently, it has been shown that almost 80% of the world dog population is actually living as a free-ranging. That means that the majority of dogs in the world are free-roaming, so they are not owned by someone. They do not mate under human, so they're freely mating. Their choices are free, and even if they live maybe alongside humans, for example, feeding on garbage, they are not under direct human control. And importantly, these dogs are genetically distinct from purebred dogs. What does it mean? Instead of being the result of purebred dogs, pet dogs that have been abandoned to the streets and then started to breed with each other, creating mixed breed dogs, these dogs are actually mongrels. So they are the genetic pool from which we started to actually select the purebred dogs that we know today and that they mostly compose our pet dog population. So during the process of domestication, actually, first there was a change in dogs' social ecology in comparison to wolves, and that made them starting to live closer to human settlements. And only afterwards, basically the last 150 years, there has been a very direct selection for specific morphological and behavioral traits. And this makes dogs extremely interesting because when they live as free-ranging in different areas of the world, but also when they live as pets, their degrees of association with humans and with conspecifics largely vary, creating a continuum of different environments in which the dogs live in. And this is very interesting for cognitive studies because they allow to test the effect of different life experiences and different environments on their cognitive abilities and behavior in general. In fact, one can argue that having been in different environments where there are different social and physical challenges, well, they might need to develop or use different cognitive abilities. And therefore, in different areas of the world, in different kind of environments, we would see differences in behavior and cognition between dogs. And not only from the theoretical perspective, but also from the practical perspective, studying dogs can create a bridge between laboratory and field studies because we can either test them in the lab in controlled conditions, but also then apply methods in the wild, on the field, and therefore create methods and setups that can work in both situations. At the Domestication Lab in Vienna, we have the unique opportunity of testing 3 different populations of dogs, at least for now. We hope for more in the future. First of all, pet dogs living in Austria. Owners can come with their dogs to the Clever Dog Lab in Vienna, and they can participate to behavioral and cognitive studies, and then they go back and live their lives normally. So the advantage of studying these dogs is that we can test them in very controlled laboratory conditions, and we know almost everything about their rearing history. But of course, there is a lot of variability, and there is often the confounding factor of breed. And then we have access to the dogs that are hosted at the Wolf Science Center. The Wolf Science Center is a scientific facility where dogs and wolves are raised in identical ways. And the animals here are hand raised in the first weeks of their lives. And then a few months, they join packs and they continue to live in packs in large enclosures throughout their lives. So they mostly live in their everyday life, and their main social partners are other dogs, but they continue having, of course, direct contact and routine activities also with humans, with the trainers and experimenters that work there. And in 2016, we started working in Morocco, so in the south of Morocco, close to the city of Agadir, in a coastal area that is characterized by small fishing villages, but is also quite touristic. There is a population of around 300 dogs, at least in the area that we managed to cover with our resources. And dogs live out, so they feed on human refuse and they form groups, but they also, of course, interact with humans. But these are free-ranging dogs, so they are actually not under human control, neither for reproduction nor for their movements. Therefore, they are more representative of what is the majority of the dog world population. If we think about comparing these different groups, then one can formulate different hypotheses. If we think that dog domestication actually changed dog behavior and dog cognitive abilities quite strongly, and therefore experience doesn't really play a role that much anymore, then we would expect to not find differences across populations. However, if we think that actually life experience and the environment in which these animals live in play a role, and for example, experience with objects or experience with humans is influencing dogs' cognitive abilities and performance in social cognitive tasks, then we would expect that pet dogs living in cities and having close contact with humans would perform better than both science center dogs that still have a lot of experience with cognitive testing and objects than free-ranging dogs, who still might encounter objects, but usually objects are not really fundamental for their survival because they found food that is not encapsulated, that is easy to retrieve. So they usually do not need to solve at least big problems from the physical perspective. But on the other hand, one can think that free-ranging dogs being under selective pressure and needing to survive in the environment they live in, they might need to solve problems, not only physical, but also social, and therefore they might perform better than both science-centered dogs and pet dogs. In the last years, we conducted different studies comparing these three different populations, and we conducted some problem-solving tasks, but also we tested them in direct interactions with humans, measuring their behavior, physiology, and epigenetics. In a very famous task, that is the impossible task, in which basically a dog is faced with an apparatus that first is easily to solve, and then food can be retrieved from it, then is exposed to the same apparatus, but that become stuck and impossible to be solved. And we measured whether there was a difference between the three different populations in the time they spent trying to solve the task. And they did not manipulate the task, the apparatus that much. And there was no difference across both science-centered dogs, pet dogs, and free-ranging dogs. Actually, in this study, we tested free-ranging dogs in India, living in Mumbai and Bangalore. Later on, we also tested free-ranging dogs living in Morocco, and we compared them to pet dogs. While in the first study, a human was always present, in the second study, we had a slightly similar, different task, but we had also two different conditions in which one human was present or the dog was tested alone to see if this would play a difference and if life experience would modulate a difference in this regard. But also in this case, we did not find any difference in the time spent manipulating the apparatus. Both pet dogs and free-ranging dogs actually did not do that much. Then we tested actually two different, so pet dogs in two different conditions, either in a dog area in the city or in a dog care center where that was very familiar to the animals and also free of disturbance, because in a dog area, there were often people passing by or other dogs passing by. And then we tested free-ranging dogs and both science centered dogs. In this task, we wanted to see if there was a difference across the different groups in how they interacted with unfamiliar humans and if they had any preference depending on the interaction they had with unfamiliar humans. So what did we do? In a pre-test, we exposed dogs to either one experimenter that would pet them for some time, or a human experimenter that was feeding them. So we did both conditions with each dog, and then we tested them in a choice task in which they could choose to interact either with the food providing person or the petting person. What did we find? We found that in the pre-test, the dogs did not really differ that much across the different populations in terms of how much time they spent with the cuddling experimenter. So in particular, pet dogs in the dog care center, free-ranging dogs and wolf science center dogs did not differ, suggesting that there was no effect of experience. But these three groups interacted more than pet dogs tested in a dog area, showing that disturbance might have played a role in the time the animals spent interacting with the person. And then we measured the likelihood of choosing the cuddling experimenter, and we found absolutely no difference across the different groups. So they all, in the old groups, they chose 50-50. So 50% of the dogs chose the cuddling experimenter and 50% chose the food providing experimenter, which is kind of surprising because one would expect in this specific situation that free-ranging dogs that are maybe less fed than other dogs in the other groups, then they might be more attracted by a human that is providing food. But this was not the case. So based on these first studies, we could find support for the first hypothesis, according to which experience actually doesn't really play that much of a role. So we found no differences across populations. And of course, I need to say this. I mean, the free-ranging dogs in Morocco are quite social. So at least in a situation like this one, where they were interacting with unfamiliar humans, maybe it didn't matter so much. Therefore, we didn't find a big difference with the other groups. But the studies I've just presented highlight one point. It is the one of the experimental context. So in the moment in which you compare different populations, then of course that are in the more or less disturbed areas in this particular situation, you have to be aware that you need to control for all the experimental context, and because this might play a role and influence how the subjects behave. But what about interacting with familiar humans? We thought that, of course, having free-ranging dogs being, and in general also the pet dogs and the wolf science center dogs having experience with unfamiliar humans, then maybe this effect of life experience did not matter so much. But maybe in the moment in which we test interactions with familiar humans, then differences would emerge. So we tested, in this case, only wolf science center dogs and pet dogs in an experiment in which we presented them with two conditions. In one condition, they were interacting with a hand raiser in the case of the wolf science center dogs, or the owner in the case of pet dogs. So the person was showing an interest in interacting with them, and then they could choose whether to spend time close to the person and being cuddled. And then we tested them in a condition in which the person was a familiar human. And we collected urine samples before and after each condition to measure the oxytocin and the cortisol, as both the oxytocinergic and the glucocorticoid systems are very important in mediating social behavior in general and social relationships more in particular. And it has been shown in other species that they are affected by life experience. We found differences in this case between pack dogs and pet dogs. In particular, while in pack dogs, so the wolf science center dogs, there was no change neither in oxytocin or cortisol when tested with the hand raiser. In the moment in which they were tested with the familiar human, they had an increase in cortisol, but no change in oxytocin. And this was reflected on their behavior, as in fact they prefer to interact with the hand raiser than with the familiar human. A different picture emerged for the dogs, the pet dogs, as in this case, there was no rise in cortisol. they did not show a preference for the owner or the familiar human, but when they interacted with the owner, there was an increase in oxytocin. One could say that maybe these differences might be due to the genetic background. I mean, the pet dogs that we tested were mixed breed dogs, but still it is possible that, of course, the genetic background might play a role. So it's not, these results that we find are not result of an effect of life experience. So in another study, we actually followed dogs since they were born. For 2.5 years, and we followed epigenetic changes. That means we measured whether the oxytocin receptor gene, which is an important part of the oxytocinergic system, would be modulated through time depending on life experience and its epigenetic changes, and in particular the methylation of 4 gene promoter locations would be affected by life experience. And what did we do exactly? So we had 2 dog litters. So we had puppies that were related to each other, and half of the dogs were adopted as pets when they were 2 months old, while the other half of the dogs remain living at the Wolf Science Center as pack dogs. And we took buccal cells regularly, before adoption, after adoption, and when they were adult, when they were around 2.5 years old, and we measured their methylation on different locations of the oxytocin receptor gene promoter. And what we found is that, yes, there was a change in methylation over time. I here present you just 2 examples. So in the pet dogs, we consistently found across the different locations a decrease in methylation, which basically would allow a higher expression of the oxytocin receptor gene, and therefore a higher production of the oxytocin receptor, while there was no change over time in pack dogs. So the methylation levels remain constant. And depending on the location, either during adulthood or immediately after adoption, we found that Wolf Science Center dogs had higher methylation levels than pet dogs. This second set of results actually would suggest that experience with humans matter, and specifically probably the bond with the owner matter. And therefore we found different modulation of cortisol, oxytocin, both from the physiological and the epigenetic perspective in the pet dogs compared to Wolf Science Center dogs. Unfortunately, I mean, of course, also because it's difficult to assess who is a familiar human for a free-ranging dog, we couldn't test this population. But maybe in the future we can think about some settings in which we could also follow longitudinally free-ranging dogs that either remain living on the streets or maybe they get adopted by people, because this happens sometimes. What can we conclude? That problem-solving performance and interactions with unfamiliar humans is quite similar across dog populations. So that doesn't seem to be a life experience effect. But interactions with familiar humans are differently modulated in pet and Wolf Science Center pet dogs. So in this case, life experience, most likely the having an owner, so having a close bonded human matters. Of course, this is just the beginning, so we still have a lot of work to do. Of course, it would be interesting to conduct more tests, testing different cognitive abilities, and also, of course, compare different free-ranging dog populations, as depending on the areas, they might interact with other species than just humans. They might live very far away from humans in forested areas, and they might, depending on the different areas of the world, the different countries, because of differences in human culture, then we might find differences in how people interact with them, and therefore how the dogs then behave towards them. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank everybody who made these studies possible. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to contact me. This is my email address, and don't miss Frederica Ranga's talk if you're interested in actually dogs and wolves differences. Thank you very much.